like Love Island, but instead of bodies, it's hot minds coupling up.
Oh.
None hotter than this panel. So, I'm delighted, I'm very, very excited about this panel. I'll try to rein it in a bit. But I'm delighted to introduce to you 100 years of the suffragettes, through which we'll be looking at 3 different areas in which women have been failed. Science has failed women, history has failed women, and the law has failed women. And we'll be exploring that, and we'll be looking at what can be done about it as well, so do have questions ready. First, let me introduce my very hot-minded panel. First here, Angela Saini, who is a very distinguished journalist, and like all the best people, she's a radio person. You know, started with presenting radio shows on Radio 4 and World Service. She presents, in between writing books and winning multiple awards. Angela's academic career very brilliantly spans Oxford University, King's College, MIT, above average chance that she knows what she's on about. So let's dive into her current book, right here, bold choice of colour. It's called Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong, and the new research that's rewriting the story. So we'll be coming to that very soon. I'm going to also introduce the wonderful Anita Anand, who I believe sprinted here straight from Any Answers, is that right?
Came off Any Answers, got shouted at about Brexit to be with you here. So,
so if you want to shout about Brexit, she's
don't
your
do
gal.
that. Okay.
So Anita Anand is just your, you know, amazing best-selling author woman, distinguished journalist, Westminster Hour, daily politics, daily Brexit wranglings, and of course Any Answers, which I must say, the thing that I love that you do so well there is whilst being shouted at and sometimes having to shut people down, is drawing out voices that don't always get heard.
Thank you.
Which is a really important job of journalists, and which brings me to her book. I'm holding up the right book. This is Anita's book, Sophia, Princess, Suffragette, Revolutionary. I was so excited to meet her through your book. I wouldn't have found her otherwise. And it's about the enabling of these voices from history and finding out more about them that we'll be doing in our section. And it brings us on to Helena Kennedy, also on the panel. Let's clap. Where to begin? Okay, she's a famous human rights lawyer, just at the Queen's Counsel. She then took on the House of Lords.
If you kill your husband, I'm your woman.
I was going to say, actually. A few people took down your details.
I know.
So, well, it's a lively crowd. But you have taken on the cases that were the least comfortable. You've represented the people that had the fewest friends in high places.
That's true.
And you took the same attitude into the House of Lords and never did what you were told. And then you went to Oxford University and took over as principal of Mansfield College, whose intake of state school students promptly went through the roof. And it occurs to me as I look at your career trajectory that bastions of power and privilege are like catnip to you. You just get right in there and start making mayhem and disrupting.
Yes.
And we celebrate that.
Yes.
Anyone that follows, as you should, Legally Blonde and Reese Witherspoon will also know that Legally Blonde 3 has just been announced, and it's about Helena Kennedy. If my strongly worded letters to Reese have been taken seriously. This is Helena's book from 25 years ago, but it's about to come out again.
In October. Wait till October. Don't bother getting it just now. Anyway,
so
no, it's fine.
What mattered 25 years ago and what matters now is a really interesting point that we'll be diving into very shortly. I've got some
I think that was the update in 2004. So that one's 14 years old, that one.
Right.
But the original was 25 years old.
So I've got the middle one.
And so let me just tell you, the law has not developed well enough in that time. Spoiler alert.
Right.
Yes.
Angela, I want to start with you. This book, by the way, is there's a great quote on the back. One of the reviews says, an immensely readable and compelling book, providing up-to-date and evidence-based ammunition for readers who want to rebuff tired myths, stereotyping men's and women's bodies and brains and bodies. So all your arguments with uncles, arguments in the pub, this is the book you need. Things like when people go, well, women have wombs and men were cavemen, therefore X, Y, Z. She provides a really calm, thoughtful takedown. And I've got to say, you're very patient.
Thanks.
What was the bit that really annoyed you?
Well, I can't pick out one bit. I was annoyed all the time. But, you know, as a journalist, you've got to keep yourself steady. You've got to give everyone the benefit of the doubt all the time, even when someone's telling you something that is so egregious or so offensive that you want to knock their lights out.
Can you give us an example, say, from the evolutionary psychologist? Can you give an example of the kind of...
One of the things that disappointed me the most was there is a very eminent evolutionary biologist called Robert Trivers, and you may not have heard of him, but he is as important to evolutionary biology as Richard Dawkins is today. He's still alive. He lives in Jamaica. And he, in the 70s, kind of wrote the textbook on human sexual behavior, on the differences between men and women, and why we have evolved the way we have. And he had a colleague, Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, who was another evolutionary biologist, one of the first women primatologists to then work in this field. And he told her, just when she was doing the most groundbreaking work, kind of rebuffing these long-standing male orthodoxies about the differences between men and women, taking this down, he said to her, you should stay at home and look after your children. He told a reporter this. And I asked him about it when I was writing the book. So this is many years later. This happened in the 70s, and I asked him. And he said the only thing he regretted was that that comment was made public. He didn't regret anything else. And that really bothered me.
Tell us more about Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, because she's an extraordinary person.
She's incredible. So one of the things I do in the book is I look at research, long-standing research, and we may think that, you know, science has nothing to do with suffrage or with women's rights. But when we talk about, you know, who are women, what is our role in society, male superiority, male dominance over the centuries, science actually has a lot to say about this. This is as much really a biological question as anything else, arguably. And for a long time, for many centuries, science has been male-dominated. So it should come as no surprise to us that this small subset of people have also been painted this portrait of women that has been very biased. So for example, even Charles Darwin, and he wrote this in his public work and in his private letters, thought that women were intellectually inferior to men. And the reason he thought this was because he looked at Victorian society and he saw that women weren't achieving what men were achieving. You know, leave aside the fact they didn't have the vote, they didn't have access to higher education, they didn't have access to the professions, they were barred from the scientific academies. Women weren't achieving what men were achieving. And he assumed this must reflect a biological fact. And people had done that for centuries. So first we have patriarchy, which puts women in their place. Then we have scientists telling us that the reason we're in this place is because of who we are. And this went on for years. It went on throughout the 20th century. So Robert Trivers, John Simons, another evolutionary biologist in the 1970s, said that men were naturally promiscuous and women were naturally monogamous. This is another thing I take down. And women like Sarah Hrdy, you know, when they were finally given a place at the table, and it took them a really long time. Let's not forget, the Royal Society didn't admit women until 1945. That's within living memory. So, you know, things took a really long time to change. Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy was one of these first female professors within biology, and she looked at John Simons and Robert Trivers' work, and this presumption dating all the way back to Darwin, that women, because of their sexual behavior, because, I mean, this is the root of it. The peacock and the peahen. The peacock has these beautiful big feathers, and the reason for this is that he has to impress the female, and his goal is to impregnate as many females as possible. Whereas the peahen is, in comparison, very drab-looking, because she's kind of chaste, modest, doesn't need to be impressive because, you know, the men come to her. And he extended this to humans, Darwin did, and said that the male of our species is better artistically, creatively, in terms of intelligence, in every respect, because they have to attract women in order to spread their seed as widely as possible. And this kind of sexual behavior argument was extended and extended and extended. And Sarah Hrdy looked at this idea that women are naturally chaste and modest, and she looked at history. And she said, take the example of female genital mutilation. Now, here is a practice that has been inflicted on millions of women alive today, usually at a very young age, And if you don't know what it is, it's essentially cutting you and then sewing you up. Very often, these women have to be cut open once they get married in order to be able to have sex at all. So the brutal, horrible, violent purpose of this is simply to keep a woman virginal until she gets married and then faithful to her husband after she is married, because frankly, it's too painful to do anything else.
Yeah.
Now, here is an example of female sexual repression, but we have countless examples of female sexual repression. It is written into the codes of our religions and our legal systems and marriage in lots of different ways, chastity belts and breast ironing and foot binding. In every culture for thousands of years has had elaborate, sometimes brutal and vicious ways of keeping women's sexuality repressed.
She charted all of this by way of challenging the accepted.
Sarah looked at this and she said, well, if we are so modest and chaste, then why do we do this? If we are naturally chaste, naturally monogamous, then why do we go to these lengths in the first place? And these kind of brilliant insights by Sarah, who is a feminist as well as a scientist, is an example, just one example of how women being within the sciences has really helped change what we think we know.
And she, at least, is someone who made her name, because there are many more that contributed but were never named. There's a lovely story about Beatrix Potter, who apparently, before she wrote tales about fluffy bunnies, was a very keen botanist and presented a new species of fungus to Kew and was just laughed out of the place, was told that, it wasn't new and that she couldn't report and that her findings weren't allowed to be represented. And it was then rediscovered by a man whose name is now listed as that. It just makes you think how many other stories there are of women in science.
Yeah, there's countless.
Yeah. There's another very interesting thread in your book that I'd like you to just describe for the audience. It's about it's one of those tropes of conversation, nature versus nurture. And you really take this apart in a way that's very interesting. There's an interesting quote here from one of your scientists, Fausto Sterling, who says, nature versus nurture is not the best way. It's an old-fashioned way of looking at the body and how it works in the world. She says, gender differences fall on a continuum, not into two separate buckets. Can you talk about that, please?
Well, this is a fairly new idea within the sciences, and I think for society as well, to start to think beyond the gender binaries and think about us as individuals. Because if you look at psychological studies and you look at behavior and you see how men and women differ, actually, very often we are a mosaic. I may have interests. For example, I love science fiction, and I have interests that will overlap with men. Men will have interests that will overlap with women. And that is true of pretty much everybody alive. And if you look at the brain, studies have been done into brain differences between men and women, looking at particular regions, and you may find small differences depending on the group that you're looking at. But when you take brains as a whole, we show a huge amount of overlap, which is to be expected. Now, Fausto Sterling and her colleagues, so Anne Fausto Sterling is a wonderful gender scholar in the United States who's been working in this field for decades, one of the earliest gender scholars in the world. And she has really worked hard to look beyond this system of thinking and ask, well, actually, who are we as individuals? We are products not just of gender and of race and culture and class and upbringing and all these different social factors and biology all put together. It doesn't make sense to divide us into buckets. I mean, I'm writing a book on race science at the moment, and race is an interesting contrast to this because, of course, race is a made-up idea. But we do the same thing. We make these generalizations and we put people in their places, and it's so damaging because I'll give you a quick example. My son, I have a 4-year-old son, and he loves buses and trucks and trains because he's been given so many buses and trucks and trains since he was a little kid. But recently he's developed a love of the color pink. And I took him to his parents' evening recently, and outside they had lots of hats for sale. And I said, you can pick any one. He picked the pink hat. And when we went to pay for it, the lady at the counter told him, are you sure that's the hat that you want? Do you not want the blue one or the purple one? And those tiny little inputs have such, multiplied thousands of times in the process of a child's upbringing, will have such a profound effect on the person you get at the end. So even if, as in adults, we seem to see profound gender differences, just think about where those came from and also how they shaped our minds. in the process. Our brains are not fixed at birth. They're developing all the time. If you give a child toys that exercise their spatial awareness, the regions of their brain connected to spatial awareness will be exercised as a result. You know, they will be bigger as a result. So a social input has a biological output and affects your development.
I've just found a beautiful line actually that illustrates. You describe these as countless little thumb marks on the ball of dough that is a developing child. It's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Someone's got a phone alarm going off. Switch it off. It's doing my head in.
I'm actually thinking, you know what, it's mine.
We're going mad. Oh!
It's
busted! Anita! I was about to hold your book up, but
Look,
you know.
here, I know, isn't it?
What a crime as a radio professional as well.
No, you're quite right. It's 4:05. I should be doing something really important, but I never label what I should be doing.
What would it be? Oh, I'm supposed to be on a panel.
It's mine. So sorry about that. Yeah.
Right, moving swiftly on. Here is Anita Anand's gorgeous book.
Do we even deserve to talk about it?
I think we must. I think we must. We forgive you. We still love you. Sophia, Princess, Suffragette, Revolutionary. This is a really amazing piece of work that you've done. I want to say again, thank you for doing it, because I just loved it, and I was really happy. I too have written a book about a woman who's little known and been on that journey of the more you find out, you go, oh my God, people don't know enough about this woman. So it's very exciting in and of itself, but also the timing that we're here to talk about, the 100 years since some but not all women got the vote, the representation of the people of the People Act 100 years ago. This has so many insights into the gains that have been undertaken. And I want to start with a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote in 1841, "There is no history, only biography." And I love this quote because I think what you've done is taken one person whose life shines light into decolonisation, feminism, women's rights, suffrage. One person was able to reveal so much.
And reveal so many women. I mean, that's what's been the greatest joy to me. So when you were talking, Angela, I was just saying there were hairs standing up all over the back of my neck. I mean, Bee has done this amazing job on Mary Wollstonecraft and is battling to bring her front and centre into people's sight. As I sort of do more and more with Sophia, I want people to see her, because you're quite right. It opens doors. And I never, ever thought, researching a book about an Indian princess, a book I never wanted to write. It's such hard work writing a book. I tell you, there are much easier ways to earn a living than this. But I just got compelled to, because when I started looking into her, I started meeting people. I mean, just because Angela's just spoken, Hertha Ayrton, for example, you'll know Hertha, the first woman to be allowed into the Institute of Electrical Engineers. And I write about her in the book because she's with Sophia on this dreadful day in British parliamentary democracy when women go and they demand the vote of the Prime Minister. He's promised them, Asquith has promised and promised and promised. He says, I will let you have the vote, and then right at the last minute, he guillotines the time that this bill will have to pass. So Emmeline Pankhurst says, we are going to bang down that door and make him answer. And she takes this rock star cadre of women to go and smash down the doors of Parliament. They can't all march together because the law has been passed that women, because of the suffragettes, they can't march en masse. So they say, right, fine, we won't. We'll do it in detachments of 12. You can't march in more than 12. The lead group is Emmeline Pankhurst, an Indian princess who lives at Hampton Court, and Queen Victoria is her godmother. She's Sophia, the woman I write about. Hertha Ayrton, who is this frizzy-haired, very stern woman, very, very twinkly eyes, but she has made her name as Marie Curie's Rottweiler. And this is the thing about your Waldo Emerson quote, because when Marie Curie discovered radium, and the newspapers in this country wrote about that discovery, which would eventually win her the Nobel Prize, they refused to believe it was her. They said, Pierre Curie, her husband, the discoverer of radium. And it took Hertha, you know, she made it her mission to go after each and every Paul Dacre in the land and say, you know what, you changed that. It wasn't, it was her. And she wouldn't let it go, and she would say, a lie told about a woman has more lives than a cat, so I just have to stop it. So she was there. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, another leading suffragette. So these are all women fighting for the vote. And there's no, you know, and the sadness is you haven't heard of Hertha Ayrton, have you? And we should. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first doctor in this country. Also the first mayor in this country. So she led in two fields of politics and also in medicine. She was in that first group as well. And when they marched, and her daughter, Louisa, who was also a doctor, as soon as these two qualified, they slammed the doors on women doctors because they thought that our ovaries made us unable to treat people because we get confused. So, you know, this is the first group that ends up in Parliament Square demanding the vote. And as more and more women arrive, the police turn on them with such ferocity. They've been given carte blanche to do what they want with these women that day by Winston Churchill, who doesn't want any more women arrested and clogging up the prison system, and they are beaten. They are picked up, they are thrown against walls in Parliament Square, which we know very well. You know, the Baroness goes there all the time, and I don't know, but whenever I go there, I see them. Yeah. I see it happening, you know. But the politicians came up to stand on the roof and on the railings to see police officers charging into these groups of women, women of this calibre, women who worked in the mills. They didn't care. We were all just women to them. And they used sexual assault as a weapon. And it's always the way, when you see in any war situation or wherever there is an oppression of natural democracy, they go for sexuality, as you've also pointed out. So they were ripping the clothes, sticking knees up between women's legs, throwing them into crowds of men, saying, do what you want with them. That is how we won the vote, by fighting that crap. So, and the women who did it. So it breaks my heart, and I'm really, whatever part I have to play in just bringing women like that, you know, through Sophia's story, and Sophia's another, I mean, I hope we'll talk about her as well. Yes. But she was the key to all of these lives that otherwise would never have touched mine, and I'm so grateful, so grateful.
I'd like to ask you to talk about the impact that she had back home and back in India, and how the suffragette movement is said. You said here, you know, inspired by the suffragettes, Mahatma Gandhi invited women to join as part of his Salt March, as part of his campaigns. How did that play? And also, will you tell us about the Women's Indian Association and the representative, the women that demanded representation around those times?
So Sophia was just, by virtue of who she was a celebrity. You know, she was a celebrity in this country, but she was unknown pretty much in India because her father was the last Maharaja of Punjab, a man called Dalip Singh, who was thrown out of his kingdom as a small boy, forced to sign over his kingdom and his Kohinoor, diamond, and so, you know, in Punjab, he was expelled and every vestige of him was kind of deleted. So the British wanted that memory pulled out of people's heads because Punjabis, and I speak as one, we're pretty fiery people. No. Oh, no, we like a fight. So, you know, by erasing any trace of Dalip Singh, they also erased her. She was born in this country. She's very much like me, you know, British Asian. And she grew up never feeling terribly Indian because she was surrounded. Her father was out of her life when she was quite young. Her mother died when she was very young. And she's brought up pretty much by Queen Victoria. And it's only when she makes this illicit trip to India, which she's not allowed to. No Dalip Singh children are allowed to go to India. Only the girls break the rules. There are 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and it's only the sisters who break the rules and they go and visit India. She's greeted in Punjab by this absolute avalanche of love from all of these old Sardars who fought for her father and her grandfather, and all these young Punjabis for whom she is something of, you know, regional pride.
This is a kind of consciousness-raising moment for her.
Absolutely. And so she's walking, and they're going and they're falling at her feet, saying, "Tell us what to do. Tell us what to do, and we'll do it. Well, just tell us, and we'll do it." And she, for the first time, feels her Indianness. She's like, "How is it that they still remember me?" It shakes her so hard that when she comes back, she goes to India, a pointless celebrity. Possibly would have been on Love Island if that had been around in those days. You know, she really was. She was just she was packed in magazines. That's all her job was. And she comes back a fighter. And the thing that she hears in India, you know, the cry from the nationalists, "Awaz do, awaz do, awaz do, give us a voice, give us a voice." She hears from the suffragettes, "Give us a voice." So that's it. From that moment, she is a sign-up. And from her, because she has connections, you talk about the Indian Women's Association, she meets other people like Hirabai Tata, of the, you know, the Tata family. I'm sure those of you who have any association with India, Hirabai is a matriarch in that family. They also don't really think much about sort of women's rights, but she does. And she meets Sophia with her daughter in Kashmir, and Sophia is wearing sort of a very grand outfit, but a Votes for Women badge. And they ask, "What is that?" And she explains about the suffragettes. And that is how the women's movement started, with Hirabai Tata and Ratun, her daughter. And they take it all the way through to Westminster saying, you know what, Brits and all you Indians who are trying to discuss your new constitution, if women aren't in it and if women don't get the vote, it's worth nothing to us and we're not having it. And that's why, you know, when India was born, women were voting that way. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully that explains.
And describe the shift at which, you know, you say she was a pointless celebrity, but when did she get her hooks into you?
So completely by accident. Like I said, I'm really lazy. I don't like working, and I was married to somebody who I am married to someone who writes books, and I know how hard it is. But I was on maternity leave, and I was going through, and I'm a political journalist, is what I do. And I came across a picture when I was on maternity leave of it just said women selling newspaper outside Hampton Court. And I mean, you've all heard of gaydar, but we have Punjab, we Punjabis, and I thought, it's black and white, but she looks Punjabi. I think she's Punjabi. Yeah, that's the picture.
This is the picture.
Here. And I thought, she looks like my auntie. So I started trying to find out who she was. And, you know, some things are really easy to find out. Ranjit Singh, we don't call him Ranjit Singh in India, we call him Sher-e-Punjab, the Lion of Punjab. You can find out books and books about him. Dalip Singh, books and books. I tried to get one measly book about this woman just to find out who she was. There's nothing. So it started a 4-year obsession to try and excavate her. And what became very clear is she was buried by 2 great forces. So the British wanted to bury her story because having an upstart little Indian on the streets of London defying the British Empire and, you know, defying the police and saying, come and arrest me, fighting with police officers. That's what she did. You know, she actually physically fights with police on the streets of Westminster. That is not the message they want going back to India, that a little chit of a girl is taking us on. And on the other side, when Britain got the vote after the war, you know, they didn't want to be reminded of this time when the suffragettes, you know, when the daughters of Britannia were having fights with the sons of Britannia, they needed to heal after the war. So all of these reasons, kind of layers and layers of deletion. And it took quite a lot of digging her out from that.
And I do believe you dug her out to such an extent that wasn't she on a stamp?
She was on a stamp.
On a postage stamp.
On a stamp here in Great Britain. So, you know, there was a suffragette special edition of stamps which came out a couple of months ago. And that same picture that hooked me into her life, I mean, I'm so proud. I could cry. It makes me a bit weepy, actually. And she's the stamp. Yeah. There she is.
That would not have happened otherwise, you know. It all matters. So these things really matter. Yeah. Right, Helena, let's come to you. And as you've clarified, this is the middle edition of a number. So it's a sort of work in progress. It's moving onwards. I'd like to read a quote from this edition where you talk about the number of different ways in which the law fails women, in particular women of colour. And you write, I've written it down here, with regard to race, there has to be recognised that people do not start equal, that the old British playing field is not level. It's not level. How was it not level when you first wrote this, and how is it not level now?
I mean, I came to practice from Scotland, and of course my forebears were Irish. We'd been immigrants from Ireland to Scotland, and then I came down to study English law. And I suppose that gave me a sort of foot inside my profession and a foot outside. I saw it with a slightly probably different set of eyes, both as a woman who came from a particular background. And so being an outsider gives you a special, I think, a way of seeing things. And I started, women, you've got to understand that women make up a very small percentage, in fact, of people who end up before the courts, by and large. But I found that I ended up doing many more cases for women than my male colleagues. And by the time I was a QC, I wrote this book because I've been writing about women and broadcasting about women in the law for such a long time, and I felt it all had to be pulled together. And it was so interesting, at that point in 1992, when the book originally came out, there was total denial amongst the judiciary. They all said, it's not true. Women are treated just the same as men. There is a level playing field. That was the great thing, the British level playing field. We breathe in those stories that are told about British culture, that we are about fair play and decency. Well, the truth was, as I saw it, was that women had not been part of laws making. And while things have been changing, I mean, when I started in the law in the 70s, there were very few, only 6% of women of practitioners at the bar were women. And it was very low in the solicitor's profession too. And there were very few women in the senior courts. And as you know, law is made in a number of different ways. And in the common law system, law is made by the senior judiciary making decisions which then bind lower courts. So who make those decisions? They were men. Who were in Parliament? Very few women. And in the major sort of making of statute law, it was men. So law was made, you know, you didn't even have to be a conspiracy theorist. It was made because it was men who were lawmakers, and a bit like the business of in science. You then got a male perspective on what the rules should be and how they imagined law. And so you had tests like the test of the reasonable man. There were no reasonable women. And there were, you know, the man on the Clapham omnibus and all that sort of thing. Now, of course, they would say, well, of course, we mean the woman too. But many of those tests did not work to deal with the reality of women's lives. And so I started looking at why it was that the conviction rate in rape cases was so low, what happened in those cases. I did the cases. I saw what was going on, that women ended up being shamed in the witness box, being cross-examined in ways that really were putting them on trial rather than the person in the dock. And so I started writing about this when nobody else was really writing about it. And I was doing it from first-hand experience. I was also dealing with the business of domestic violence, the ways in which that was not taken seriously by the police and the authorities. And they used to say, kiss and make up. And, you know, it's just, you know, what working-class people do, and didn't accept that it ever happened in other classes at all. And so that was one of the problems that I started writing about and broadcasting about. But when I wrote the book in 1992, the whole thing was that this was really not a serious issue, that nobody noticed the gender of people who were in the dock or people who testified in front of courts. And it just wasn't true. And it became very important to make it, as you've done, make it evidence-based, to look at what happened in the courts and so on. Now, time has passed, 25 years and more. And what happens is that I monitor it regularly. And I keep a very close tally on what's happening. The fabulous thing is that because of the spread of education to many more people, many, many women have come into the law. And the legal profession now has huge numbers of young women, which is fantastic. What they still face a lot of the time is that they end up doing areas of law which are about the human condition. And so those areas are very poorly remunerated.
What areas are they?
Well, family law, children's law, criminal law, all the stuff that we as lawyers, women tend to kind of gravitate towards, they're interested in, but also they would be pushed towards it. Nowadays, you've got many more women going into commercial law, going into corporate law, going into all the areas of law. But there's still some areas where it's bloody difficult. It's a bit like the last week's report saying that, you know, when it comes to the boards, why are there so few women on the boards of companies in Britain? And the answers were, well, we've got one. Well, let me tell you, that's what they used to say in sets of chambers. So you'd say, you know, with the Sex Discrimination Act, and before that they'd say we don't take women. And then they'd have the Sex Discrimination Act, and they'd say, women, we've got one. We've got one. And that's what boards are now saying, women, we've got one. You know, we've done that. And I remember when I was on the telly with one of the senior judges, I remember him saying, Helena, I have always been on the side of women. I voted for them to join the Kennel Club. You know, so that was, we were allowed in there, but on the senior courts, no. So there was a problem.
Can I just pause? There's a really horrible incident in this book that you describe when you're a student at Gray's Inn, sorry. And you talk about an incident where someone spots that you're not wearing correct dress code. Yeah. And you're kind of made to parade. It's a really haunting incident. Yeah, it was. It's a truly horrific passage of really just vile bullying of a female student. And do you think that would happen now?
Oh no! I mean, happily, a lot of that stuff, which was so overt.
What did they do?
Well, I mean, basically, we used to have a thing where, in order to learn advocacy, people could, when you dined, you had to eat dinners in order to qualify. Only the English would think up such a thing. That was what my mother used to say. You have to eat dinners in order to become a barrister. And so when we ate the dinner formally in a hall, we would dress in a gown which went over our clothes, and we had to wear wear black. And I had a very chic little black mini dress, which was crocheted, but which I used to wear an underslip under. It was very modest. But somebody suggested they could see through my little scheme. And so the senior in hall asked me to parade up. Well, first of all, I was asked to stand on the table. And then to parade up to be examined to see whether I was suitably attired or not. And so it was about humiliation, you know.
No,
it was all the men all banged with their spoons on the table.
Yeah.
And there were probably only about maybe, you know, half a dozen women in the whole of this hall of about 200 men. So it was pretty unpleasant. But I don't believe that would happen today. But I want to just say why I'm updating the book. Because the truth is that underpinning law are so many stereotypes and myths and assumptions, the sort of things that you're talking about which are normative, the ideas about promiscuity, about the different kinds of sexual expectations of women that there would never be of men. And those still live on in the courtrooms. The whole way in which of slut shaming, of shaming of women, you know, when they come to give evidence to say, yes, I may have been out dancing, yes, I may have had, you know, a glass of wine too much, but I certainly made it very clear I did not want to have sex with this person, and he forced it on me in a taxi or whatever. And really horrifying stories, and they continue to be told. And, you know, you've only had, I don't know if any of you read recently about the case in Northern Ireland of a group of rugby players, you know, who were in the national team. And there were 4 of them. And if you read the detail of that case, which I'm documenting in this new book, you know, and yet they were all acquitted. And, you know, it's a really horrifying account of what women have to go through if they want to try and get justice. So the problems still exist, and we have to remember that, I mean, my answer to the business of Me Too is that Me Too, which has actually caught fire around the world, Me Too is not, I mean, you know, this is, we've got to see what it really is. And it actually is about law's failure to deliver justice to women. If women thought that they could get to the courts and actually get justice, then they wouldn't be actually going online and telling their stories that way. That's not what they would want to do. This
is the moment to, I'm sure you're all bursting with questions because we've moved so far around this extraordinarily packed subject. Are there any questions? Oh my goodness, I thought you'd have loads. There's one at the back, yes.
Thank you so much for that. Great hearing the conversation. I have a question about sort of, in all of this, where are the gender-sensitive men? And are we talking about them enough, A? Are we making them role models, B? And what are we doing to make sure there are more gender-sensitive men in the cultures that we grow up in?
Is anyone particularly like to direct that question to?
No, I think just the
Angela.
We've obviously got gender-sensitive men in the audience.
Would you like to? Well, women's rights, we wouldn't have women's rights if it weren't for men who have positions of power also helping the women get those rights. So we're kind of, whether we like it or not, we're dependent on the men who have positions of power and responsibility to help us. And actually, if you look at the history of women in science, the women who have managed to get ahead, who have managed to make a name for themselves against the odds, it's very often that they were working with their husbands or their fathers, or there happened to be a man in the department who saw the potential of women and then gave them a place. It's unfair that that's how it had to be because there was no other option. They didn't have any other option. But we are reliant on that. And I have to say, in my own life, one thing I've learned since writing Inferior, I've had so much love and support from many women, especially women in science and young women in science particularly, partly because of Me Too. There's this kind of groundswell. It almost feels like a civil rights, a new movement happening across race and gender and everything. And I've also had some very, very incredibly supportive men who have championed my work, who have put it on their syllabuses in universities, who have told people about it. So, you know, this isn't a men versus women issue, I don't think, at all. It's about what side of the divide are you on? Do you want a more equal world, or do you not want a more equal world?
Did you want to respond?
I mean, I would say sort of historically, there were, I mean, exactly the same way in politics, which is what I'm concerned with primarily. You know, the bill that was introduced to give women equal votes was introduced by a man by virtue of the men who dominated politics at that time. Had they not done it, had there not been people who were moved by the women's arguments, it just wouldn't have got a hearing. Now, though, what I see in politics is I see sisters doing it for themselves. You know, there are decent, wonderful men. I like to think that they're just decent people. It's the people who are, as you say, I think it's more helpful rather than to say sort of men and women these days is right and of the past. That's all. They are just so left behind. I mean, I did a thing yesterday. There's a thing called the Wreath Lectures, and it's a very sort of sober thing that Radio 4 does. And I was so struck by the second lecture that went out that most of the questions and the most probing questions were coming from young women, and they weren't waiting for permission. You know, and you're the first one to ask a question here. Well done. Proves my point. But, you know, I think the sisters doing it for themselves thing is now a very big... There's almost a quantum of movement that happens.
There was a question here, and then there's two more. Can the people with microphones start moving in? Because there's a couple of people keen there. And can there be questions and concise? Because I think we have to wrap up by 1:45. Is that right? Yes. So...
Helena, can I just ask a question about the international context? I mean, I think as we're here now, I think the G7 putting very strong recommendations about gender equality. But I just want to ask about some of the work you're doing in the UK. Don't you feel that some of the ways to drive change in the UK may also be to draw upon much more of the international context? You know, some of that World Bank, Women, Business and Law report, and Patricia Scotland being in the Commonwealth and stuff. You know, bringing a spotlight internationally to say it's not a developing country issue or a developed country issue. It's an international issue, and maybe driving greater domestic change, we can do an international spotlight. Thoughts on that?
I agree with you entirely. I mean, wherever I travel, these issues are the same everywhere. And women nowadays, I mean, what's wonderful is that women the world over have been saying, are no longer silent about the issues. The things that used to be a source of shame, women are sort of throwing that off and saying, I'm going to talk about what's going on. And it's true, and I want to add my voice to saying, lots of men are actually being, our partners in creating this change, and you're one of them. But I mean, talking about this internationally and saying that, when it comes to aid, that our concerns about the position of women in society should be part of it. The whole business about the way in which we're creating international policy, there should be, how does this play out for women? What is this impacting on women? And it should be happening in all of our government departments. It shouldn't be that you need to have a women's special unit for women. It should be on every agenda. It should be saying, and how does this specifically impact on the lives of women? Are we doing enough in education for girls? How is it working out? And that should be on the G7 agenda. It's very difficult, though, when you've got the United States of America having a president who basically talks about, in the most foul way, about women, and whose attitudes to women seem so poor. And when I saw him signing off this thing, the aid would not, as coming from the United States, would not allow for reproductive freedom for women around the world, and there wasn't a woman signing at the table. He had sort of 8 men there to witness his signing of this particular executive order. It's shocking. So that's always a problem, is that you'll have rather uninspiring men rather than inspiring men who are often involved in this. But I agree with you entirely. It has to be on the international plane.
And that's very important to reflect at this juncture of 100 years, this punctuation mark. Let's look at what still needs to change, what things are just stubbornly refusing to change. There are a few questions around the middle. Please keep your hand up and make sure that persist. And yet she persisted. Make sure that the microphones get to you.
Yes, and yet she persisted.
Good.
Just pass it in. There you go.
Have a whole conversation in hashtags. Let's go. Quickly, we're going to run out of time. Yes, why not?
I'm a master's student and in publishing industry, and currently I'll be doing my research in lack of women leaders in publishing. So my question to you is there are so many women who enter for the entry-level jobs because of the rise of education and all. But when you go to boardrooms, they are not there. So what happens in between? Is that about maternity leave, or what are the career blocks of women facing?
What we'll do is we'll go along and take a few questions and then we'll bunch them together and see who wants to answer them. So next, please, coming to you.
In the context of 100 years of celebrating the suffragettes, do you think that technology is a barrier or enabler for women in politics and looking to go into politics?
What role of technology?
And on that note, what is the role of formal education in bringing out gender equality?
Okay, and one here. It's very hot in here, sorry. Please try to stay awake. We're trying to keep the energy going so you don't all go to sleep. There was one more question here. Do you want to just shout it out and I'll then shout it back to the audience so we don't get the delay? And then you.
Targets, quotas.
Positive discrimination.
Great!
And yours?
So I find it very disturbing that whenever there is a conversation about having women on the table, it's a question of equality and allowing women to come in and granting them this right. How do we make it a conversation around women being part of the conversation because they were productive financially in the financial sector, they bring excellence when they're in medicine and excellence when they're in education. So how do we make it a conversation about women actually bringing equality up to the table rather than being allowed in because it's more equal?
Right. Thank you. So we've got a few there. We've got addressing the lack of women leaders. We've got what role technology has this 100 years since suffragettes, the role of formal education. What about positive discrimination? And, you know, taking the chair at the table rather than being allowed. One more.
Yeah, what about women being said to be the worst enemies of women?
Worst enemies of men?
Of women.
Of women. Oh, women being their own worst enemies. Oh, right, okay.
German Greer and the...
Oh, worst enemies. These are all very sparkly questions. Is there one that grabs you?
Well, trying to tie everything together, I should say that my book came out last summer, and in many of the events that I've done, one question that often comes up is women asking me, well, you know, if we get all these rights too quickly, then won't men feel threatened? Will there be a backlash? Will they feel, you know, we have to look after these men because they feel so beleaguered and threatened by this idea of women gaining equality, and we have to think about them as well. And I ask myself, and I say to them, well, for hundreds of years, no men have been asking, you know, there are no women here, shouldn't we be worried about the rights of women or the rights of our mothers and daughters and sisters who aren't getting their fair play? So I wonder sometimes, I understand that when you have very rapid social change, it's scary for everybody. And so you want to take it easy. And that's why we take the softly approach. We make those gentle arguments and we do things, you know, we talk about equality first rather than pushing and fighting and being violent because we don't want to upset the system so much that there's a backlash that actually makes things worse in the long run. But I think there's an argument to be made for pushing harder. I really do. Because the pushback has already started, and it is pretty violent.
It's called Donald Trump, so
let's
call it what it is. And I think so that chimes very much with your comments about, you know, should we just be taking the seat at the table rather than asking for it?
Yeah, we don't need to
Thanks for that. I'd like you guys to respond to some of these other interesting points.
The one about the fact that technology is running apace and
social media.
Well, I was just going to say, so there are two strands to that. There is the one which is you can no longer argue that women are frail and physically weak because machines will increasingly do more and more of the work that involves physical labour. So that is going to be, has already created a revolution after the war and continues to do so. The other thing that is really important is social media. So very recently, I don't know if you saw, but Variety, our publishing question friend, Variety had the writers' room they were advertising. They had 12 writers that everybody had to pay tickets to go and see. Not one woman, not one. And social media immediately engulfed them with a tidal wave of fury, which made Variety, which I don't think, you know, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. I think within 24 hours, they actually put their hands up and said, we've really, really messed this up. We are so sorry. It was indefensible, and they didn't try and defend it. So, you know, in those respects, The good thing about social media, which can also be the bad thing about social media, is it amplifies voices. So you don't now need to go through a male editorial board or a male publishing board. You can shout and you will be, if you have a message that others, and this is men and women, amplified that and went after variety. It's just an example from yesterday, but it happens time and time again.
I want to touch on the technology thing too. I actually think, of course, there's the boon, which is that social media has made it possible for women across continents to get together to talk about the way in which their lives can be beleaguered by horrible things like sexual harassment in the workplace. And, you know, we've had it with film stars, but it's happening to women on shop floors, in factories and so on to get, you know, they'll go to the supervisor and they'll want to have overtime because they want to spend time with their kids or a kid's sick or something, and they're expected to deliver sexual favors to people. So that sort of thing is a commonplace. The young women in my chambers who are employment lawyers document it all the time, and it's part of is a part of women's lives the world over. And so coming together using technology to voice this is really important. And women have been able to use technology very successfully there. What is a negative is the way in which, as Anita is talking about, the whole business of going after women, of trawling, of abusing women on the other, really making women's lives a misery if they stand up to speak out about certain things. The ways in which I'm now finding that the old thing of women and their sexual history being an issue in rape cases is that to go through women's social media and is one of the ways in which women are basically taken to task. Look at you, the way you're dressed in this photograph. Look at this photograph you on Facebook. Look at the fact that you've said to a man, oh, you look sexy in that. Is that a proper way for a woman to protect? Aren't you encouraging sexual, you know, all manner of stuff that comes because of social media. So it's both a boon and a problem for women in the courtroom. On the business of education, I absolutely agree with you that education is so important in all of this, and it's where women can gain their confidence and their you know, their right to be heard. And good teachers can be so important in all of that, along with parents and the role that we have as parents in helping challenge some of gender stereotypes. I want to talk about positive discrimination. Yes. I'm in favour of, for example, having quotas in certain areas. Not forever, but in order to somehow tip the balance, that you put your finger on the scales. If you're looking for senior women on boards, then you have to say, we really have to go out there and find women and create pools of women. I mean, one of the people that has been you know, heard on this has been saying there are many women in the public sector and so on. You don't have to just look in the private sector if you've got private sector boards. You can look elsewhere and you can get women who have been the heads of schools and so on, and they will bring their experience to this, and it's about valuing the experience of women, and that's one of the problems. Women's experience is often undervalued.
Does anyone disagree, interestingly, on the idea of quotas and positive discrimination?
You see, I'm now in favour of quotas, and it took me a while to get there.
It's an interesting... India has a very interesting history of quotas and so forth, so I'd be interested to hear from Indian women in the audience who have something to say about that. Is it... Was that it was your question, wasn't it?
No, it was a question
sorry.
up there.
My question, I also...
Come to you.
That's right.
After 25 years.
You're now with me.
Come round, and what's your view?
You said not forever, but that was the same rationale under which the current system of caste and gender-based reservations in India operates. They were supposed to be there only for 10 years, and Ambedkar said that, you know, by then education will have advanced and we won't need them after 10 years. We still need them, and unfortunately they become vote banks. So there is always a danger of that happening, of it crystallizing into something political.
But then you look at something different. You look at Norway, where they actually brought in a policy which was that a third of all boards had to be women. And let me tell you, it's worked. Yeah. It's worked, and it hasn't decreased the quality of the board. You know, the idea is that somehow it's going to dilute the port, you know, if you have senior women judges who might have come in a different track. And I just think that we have to get over this. And then I want to just talk about women not supporting other women. There is a special place in hell. A special place in hell.
I don't think we can do better than that. Right, I'm very sorry to have to bring this to a close now. I'm going to abuse my position here to give the final words to Mary Wollstonecraft, who I think summarises the entire effort. I have a campaign colleague here who might have some leaflets about the Mary on the Green campaign to celebrate the life of Mary Wollstonecraft. Her words, this
woman's book on this is fabulous. So let's use a clip from her.
Commercial ad break over. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote in 1792, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that incredibly enlightening talk.